Burkina Faso is no stranger to instability, but what just happened marks a turning point that could reshape West Africa's future. Russian military boots have officially touched down in Ouagadougou, not under cover of night, not as shadowy mercenaries, but as an open and deliberate deployment of state-sponsored force. These are not peacekeepers. They are elite commandos dispatched to protect one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The West may pretend this is business as usual, but it's not. This is an unprecedented shift in alliances, a message sent in broad daylight that France is no longer in charge, and that the Kremlin is now staking a claim in Africa's most volatile region. But how did we get here? To understand why 1,700 Russian troops would be guarding a young African president, you must first understand what Traoré has been facing since the day he took power. Since his rise in September 2022, his presidency has been marked not by peace but by survival. He has lived every day under threat, jihadist militias tightening their grip on rural regions, foreign media painting him as a threat to democracy, and worst of all, repeated coup attempts from inside his own military. These were not rumors. His government has publicly disclosed multiple plots to assassinate him and seize the presidential palace. According to security briefings, at least one of those plots was on the verge of execution. A coordinated assault involving both rogue military officers and terrorist cells, timed to unleash chaos and invite international intervention. The goal? Remove Traoré, fracture the state, and force Burkina Faso back into foreign hands. These were not low-level conspiracies. High-ranking officers were arrested. Investigations revealed encrypted communications between army insiders and jihadist commanders. What emerged was a disturbing picture of betrayal from within, a chessboard where every piece was moving against the presidency. In response, the capital transformed. Cabinet meetings began taking place under the protection of armed convoys. Helicopters circled government buildings, and armored vehicles appeared at strategic sites across Ouagadougou. A leader once cheered as a revolutionary became a man in a bunker, isolated, hunted, but still standing. But survival alone wasn't enough. Traoré needed a force that would not flinch, a guarantee that wouldn't waver. And in a world where traditional allies came with strings, he turned to a power that offered something the West never did: unquestionable loyalty at a price. That power was Russia, and when the French troops pulled out after decades of control, it left a vacuum no one else dared to fill. Traoré made the call, and the Russians answered. What they bring is not just muscle, it's a new contract for power in Africa. Moscow isn't coming in quietly or with deniability. This is open, deliberate, and historic, and the world is watching, not to celebrate, but to calculate what it means for the global order that once considered Africa its silent backyard. Traoré has changed that. He is no longer playing defense. Now he has backup. The arrival of Russian forces in Burkina Faso is not just about Traoré's personal safety. It is the clearest signal yet that the old order in the Sahel is collapsing. For decades, France positioned itself as the guardian of West African stability, deploying troops under counterterrorism missions like Operation Barkhane. But for the people of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, those missions brought no peace. Instead, they witnessed villages burned, families displaced, and extremist groups spreading like wildfire. By 2024, the Sahel had become the world's deadliest region for terrorism, despite the presence of thousands of European soldiers. The illusion shattered, and with it, so did the patience of millions. Across the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, anti-French protests erupted. People no longer asked for help. They demanded that foreign troops leave. They accused France of protecting its interests, not theirs, of failing to stop the bloodshed while controlling their currencies, influencing their politics, and extracting their resources. It wasn't just frustration. It was fury, fueled by a deep historical wound that never truly healed. Colonial flags may have come down decades ago, but colonial control, many believed, never really ended. In that context, Traoré's rhetoric struck a nerve. He didn't mince words. He called out the CFA franc as a tool of economic enslavement. He condemned the imbalance of foreign aid, where more wealth seemed to flow out of Africa than in. And when French President Emmanuel Macron dismissed African criticism by saying Sahel leaders had forgotten to say thank you, Traoré answered not with diplomacy, but with defiance. He said Macron had insulted the dignity of all Africans. One by one, the region's military-led governments expelled French troops. The old protector was gone, but the threats remain. With jihadist groups growing stronger and internal enemies multiplying, the need for a new partner became urgent. But not just any partner, one without a colonial past, one that wouldn't lecture or dominate, but treat them as equals. Enter Russia. For Moscow, the timing was perfect. Isolated by the West over its own actions in Europe, Russia saw an opportunity to deepen influence elsewhere. But this was no covert operation. It was a handshake in the open. The first wave of Russian personnel arrived in early 2024, not as mercenaries hiding in the shadows, but as state-backed military forces. Their stated mission? Protect Captain Traoré, help retrain Burkina Faso's army, provide counterintelligence support, and build a permanent security infrastructure. A military base was established outside the capital. Russian transport planes brought not just troops, but equipment, supplies, and grain. There were even talks of a nuclear power plant. In return, Russia gained a strategic foothold in a region once considered a French domain. But this wasn't just about geopolitics. It was also about perception. On the streets, many citizens welcomed the Russians with open arms. They waved flags, sang songs of unity, and called it a step toward real sovereignty. It wasn't about loving Moscow. It was about rejecting the West. Traoré, by inviting the Russians, made a bold calculation. That protection from a foreign power without colonial baggage was better than being left exposed by one with a history of exploitation. The gamble was clear. He was betting his life and his country's future on an alliance that would either make him a hero or cost him everything. But to him, the alternative, returning to dependence on those who had failed them for decades, was no option at all. To understand just how fragile Traoré's position became, one must step inside the walls of Ouagadougou's presidential palace, not physically, but politically. This isn't just a seat of government anymore. It's a fortress surrounded by invisible threats. According to the security ministry, assassination attempts have become routine. At least 3 major plots have been publicly acknowledged. These weren't random acts of desperation, but meticulously coordinated efforts, combining disloyal officers and jihadist networks aimed at decapitating the state. One particular plot, revealed in early 2025, sent shockwaves through the capital. Intelligence services intercepted encrypted messages between a high-ranking army official and a terrorist leader. The plan? Simultaneous assaults across the city, culminating in a raid on the palace, the assassination of Traoré, and the collapse of civilian command. It wasn't just a coup attempt. It was a strategy to break the state and invite foreign intervention under the guise of restoring order. Once again, sovereignty hung by a thread. Dozens of military officers were arrested. Investigations spread into the surrounding countries, particularly Côte d'Ivoire, where Burkina Faso officials claimed the conspirators had external support. Demands for extradition were ignored. Tensions in the region spiked. Inside Burkina Faso, the fear was palpable. Cabinet ministers began holding meetings under heavy guard. Military camps were reinforced. Helicopters hovered over sensitive sites. The entire capital functioned under a permanent state of high alert. In such an atmosphere, paranoia is not a symptom. It is survival. Traoré understood that no matter how brave his speeches, no matter how determined his reforms, he remained a marked man. His enemies weren't just terrorists in the bush. They wore uniforms. They held ranks. They shared photographs with him at official events. And that's why the arrival of Russian commandos changed everything. These men were not part of the local political machine. Their loyalty was not to a tribe, a party, or a personal vendetta. Their allegiance was transactional, tied to Moscow's interests, but in the short term, a guarantee of protection that the Burkina Faso military could no longer offer. It was a dangerous deal, but a necessary one. Because once a leader can no longer trust his own guard, sovereignty becomes a performance, not a reality. By bringing in the Africa Corps, Traoré wasn't just defending himself. He was signaling that Burkina Faso was no longer interested in playing by the old regional rules. He was breaking with history. The West had long claimed to support stability, but when the palace was under siege, no one showed up. France was gone. ICA was offered condemnation, not troops. And so Traore did what many leaders fear to do. He asked for help from outside the Western sphere. What Russia offers isn't moral judgment or democratic lectures. It offers hard power, silence, and results. And for a man facing the edge of collapse, that was enough. But this move did more than shift military posture. It shook the geopolitical chessboard. Suddenly, the Sahel wasn't just an African struggle. It became part of the broader global competition between East and West. Traore, by surviving through Moscow's protection, became not just a local figure, but a symbol of rebellion against the established order. And while many in the West saw this as dangerous, for millions in the region, it looked like courage. As the Russian flag began to appear in military zones across Burkina Faso, international observers scrambled to define what was happening. Was it occupation or partnership? Protection or provocation? For many outside Africa, the answer seemed obvious. This was Moscow exploiting instability to gain influence. But inside Burkina Faso and across much of the Sahel, the narrative was different. People weren't seeing new chains. They were watching old ones fall away. For decades, foreign powers had claimed to be allies in the fight against terrorism. Billions were spent, bases built, and yet the violence only escalated. The promises of peace from Paris and Washington felt hollow to those who buried their children after each attack. In 2024 alone, over half of all terrorism-related deaths in the world occurred in the Sahel. That grim statistic wasn't just a failure, it was a betrayal. And betrayals change people. Across Ouagadougou, murals began to appear, portraits of Traore next to Russian commandos, slogans calling for African unity and independence. Social media filled with images of citizens waving both Burkina Faso and Russian flags. Whether coordinated or spontaneous, the message was the same. We are not afraid to choose our own path. These public shows of support were not simply about admiration for Russia. They were about rage toward a global order that many believed had used Africa as a pawn for too long. The youth who filled the streets with flags and chants had grown up under the shadow of foreign advisors, foreign banks, and foreign soldiers. Now, they were finally witnessing a leader who defied all three. Of course, such shifts come with consequences. Western governments condemned the move. France called it reckless. The United States warned of destabilization. But their warning sounded weak in a region that had already endured years of chaos under their guidance. And unlike past leaders who might have backed down, Traore doubled down. In public speeches, he spoke not just of security, but of memory. He reminded his people that colonialism wasn't just history, it was a system that never truly ended. It evolved, adapted, disguised itself in policies, loans, and friendly press releases. And now, he said, it was time to end it fully. With that rhetoric, Traore cemented himself as more than a president. He became a symbol, a lightning rod for both admiration and fear. Western diplomats began reducing engagement. Development programs were frozen. Aid was quietly withheld. But instead of retreating, Traore turned to his regional neighbors. In an unprecedented move, Burkina Faso joined forces with Mali and Niger to form the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. This wasn't a symbolic pact. It was a formal, strategic declaration of collective defense and shared economic direction. And Russia, having already secured a military presence in all three, emerged as the alliance's unofficial guarantor. Together, they began dismantling old systems. The CFA franc, the colonial-era currency tied to the French treasury, was placed under review. A new joint bank was proposed. Roaming charges between the countries were abolished to increase regional communication. Even the idea of a common passport was floated. None of this happened in silence. The West watched with growing alarm as three of its former partners openly broke ranks. This was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was a region-wide movement, moving fast, speaking boldly, and refusing to look back. For the first time in decades, the Sahel was not reacting to someone else's decisions. It was making its own. And the world, whether ready or not, was being forced to listen. As the alliance of Sahel states took shape, a new kind of map began forming. One not drawn by colonial pens or shaped by international donors, but by the leaders of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso themselves. This wasn't just a regional agreement on paper. It was a political declaration with real teeth. They pledged military cooperation, created a Confederate bank in May 2025, and began pushing for complete financial and territorial independence. It was bold, it was fast, and it was dangerous. Because to reject the old system wasn't just to build a new one, it was to invite retaliation. And retaliation came in many forms. Western media outlets began portraying Traore and his allies as dictators, pawns of Moscow, threats to democracy. Policy briefings warned of growing Russian influence in West Africa, and sanctions quietly began creeping in through the back doors of financial institutions. But the narrative inside the Sahel was very different. For many citizens, these were not signs of failure. They were proof that their leaders had finally broken free. When your enemies panic, it means you're doing something right. That's how many viewed it. Of course, there was no denying the risks. Even with Russian support, the security situation on the ground remained dire. Jihadist groups continued launching attacks, overrunning military posts, and terrorizing rural communities. In fact, Burkina Faso was the most affected country in the world by terrorism in 2024. That fact alone showed how deep the wounds ran. Yet for Traore, survival was no longer enough. He needed transformation. Russian troops didn't just guard his compound, they helped train his forces, ran patrols, advised intelligence units. A new military base was set up near Ouagadougou, and Russia's Africa Corps began integrating with local command. This was not the murky Wagner group of the past. This was official, visible, strategic. The Kremlin had stepped out of the shadows and into the daylight, and the message was clear. Russia had arrived, not with speeches but with soldiers. Meanwhile, in public squares across Burkina Faso, massive rallies broke out. Tens of thousands marched not just in support of Traore, but in celebration of something bigger, the idea that their country could finally control its own future. Russian and Burkinabe flags flew side by side. Old colonial statues were torn down. Posters reading "Sovereignty or Nothing" were painted on walls. This wasn't just politics, it was psychological warfare. For a population raised under the long shadow of foreign rule, every act of defiance, no matter how symbolic, felt like liberation. Critics scoffed, warning that Burkina Faso was simply trading one master for another, that Russia too had its interests, that sovereignty secured through foreign soldiers was still sovereignty at risk. But Traore's government countered with a different argument. Russia had no colonial past in Africa, no history of domination, no legacy of exploitation. And in today's world, sometimes the absence of old scars is enough to make a new ally seem trustworthy. The West had its chance, they said. Decades of aid, advisors, and military missions had left the region poorer, angrier, and more divided. It was time for something else, even if it meant walking into the unknown. The gamble was enormous. If Russia abandoned them, if the new alliance collapsed, if the insurgents grew stronger, everything could fall apart. But to many in Burkina Faso, the greatest risk wasn't failure. It was staying where they were, stuck in a cycle of foreign dependence and internal weakness. Traore, young and under siege, had decided that even if the path ahead was dark, it was better to walk it with your own legs than crawl on someone else's leash. And now, with a new military alliance, a regional financial system, and Russian forces embedded in his capital, he was proving that walking alone didn't mean walking powerless. With each passing month, the presence of Russian forces in Burkina Faso became more normalized, even celebrated. What had initially shocked the world now became a fixture of the country's evolving security identity. Russian uniforms patrolling strategic compounds, joint military drills with Burkinabe troops, and Russian language interpreters working within defense ministry corridors. It was no longer speculation. It was reality, and it was transforming more than just security protocol. It was reshaping Burkina Faso's very definition of sovereignty. In the West, headlines warned of a creeping Russian empire. But on the ground in Ouagadougou, many saw something else. a nation taking back control by choosing its own risks. For decades, African leaders were expected to follow an invisible script, one where sovereignty was only acceptable if it came wrapped in Western approval. Traore had torn that script to pieces. He wasn't waiting for permission. He wasn't playing nice with donors. He was making deals on his terms, and that scared the old order. But fear was not enough to stop what had begun. What Traore and his regional allies had created through the AES was not just a defense pact, it was an identity, a declaration that their nations would no longer be shaped by colonial legacies or aid dependency, that they would fund their own development, train their own armies, and secure their own futures. And that required more than ideology. It required infrastructure. That's why, alongside the soldiers and surveillance equipment, Russia began supporting state development in ways that weren't widely reported. Grain shipments arrived as food prices soared. Technical teams from Moscow offered assistance in areas like energy planning and cyber defense. The proposed nuclear power plant wasn't just a headline. It was a signal that Burkina Faso wasn't thinking in survival mode. It was thinking long-term. Meanwhile, the Western reaction became increasingly inconsistent. Publicly, leaders in Paris and Washington condemned the Russian alliance. Privately, intelligence agencies monitored its success with growing unease. Because what if it worked? What if the people of the Sahel, long dismissed as too volatile to manage themselves, finally built a model that didn't rely on the IMF, World Bank, or EU? That question haunted policy circles. Because if Burkina Faso could do it, so could others. And then the control would truly begin to slip. Back home, Traore's political capital grew, not just from propaganda, but from results. Regions that had once been unreachable due to extremist activity began to see slow but meaningful signs of state return. New patrol routes were established. Civil registries reopened. Aid groups, once skeptical, quietly resumed operations under new local terms. The narrative was no longer about collapse. It was about reclamation. Of land, of voice, of future. But Traore knew that enemies weren't gone. They had simply gone quiet. He reminded the nation constantly that vigilance was not optional. His speeches were firm, sometimes harsh, warning of betrayal from within and destabilization from abroad. He spoke of ghosts in uniform, of whispers in the barracks, of foreign hands pulling unseen strings. And the people listened, because they remembered what had come before. The coups, the chaos, the false promises dressed as solutions. Now they had chosen a difficult path, but it was theirs. And even if it led through fire, they would rather burn standing than bow surviving. Russia's involvement gave them cover, but it was belief in Traore's courage that kept them moving. For the first time in decades, power in Burkina Faso didn't feel like something borrowed. It felt earned. The deeper Traore pushed into uncharted territory, the clearer it became that this was more than a political experiment. It was a battle for narrative dominance. In one corner stood Burkina Faso, flanked by regional allies and backed by Russia. In the other, a global order built on decades of economic leverage and diplomatic pressure. What made this moment different wasn't just who was involved, it was how openly it all unfolded. There were no secret negotiations, no behind-the-scenes deals. The Russian presence was on full display. And so was the West's discomfort. Reports began circulating of Western embassies reducing staff in Ouagadougou, of NGOs quietly withdrawing from rural programs, of international donors suspending project funds without formal statements. It wasn't war, but it was pressure, the kind designed to strangle a government without drawing global headlines. But Traore didn't blink. Instead, he accelerated. His administration rolled out new policies aimed at decoupling the economy from foreign dependency. Local production grants were issued. Import taxes on essential goods were revised. A national Beat Burkinabe campaign flooded the media. And through it all, the message was consistent. We will survive alone if we must, but never again on our knees. Inside the capital, a shift in psychology was taking root. Ministers no longer waited for approval from foreign consultants. Military commanders no longer deferred to overseas trainers. University professors no longer taught models that didn't fit local realities. It was subtle, but it was everywhere. A quiet revolution of mindset. the kind that colonial systems fear most. Meanwhile, Western think tanks published paper after paper warning of a dangerous precedent. They claimed that African militaries forming blocs outside Western oversight could destabilize the entire continent. But to many inside Burkina Faso, this sounded familiar. Every act of self-determination had always been labeled a threat. Kwame Nkrumah heard it, Thomas Sankara heard it, and now Traore was hearing it. Yet, like them, he refused to be defined by external panic. His focus remained clear: build, secure, and protect. One of the most controversial moves came when his government began reviewing mining contracts signed under previous regimes. For decades, Burkina Faso's gold wealth had flowed outward to foreign companies, offshore accounts, and corporate shareholders. Now Traore wanted the people to see those profits. A new resource commission was formed to audit licenses, enforce local ownership requirements, and channel revenues into infrastructure and education. The West called it populism. The people called it justice. But that kind of justice rarely comes without backlash. Reports emerged of sabotage attempts on gold processing facilities, of intelligence leaks within the military, of disinformation campaigns aimed at turning citizens against the government. Traore responded with force, tightening security, issuing national alerts, and calling for mass mobilization of civilian defense units. Critics labeled it paranoia. Supporters saw it as survival, because when you are rewriting history, you don't wait for the ink to dry before enemies come for the page. Every decision Traore made was a gamble, aligning with Russia, defying the West, dismantling old contracts. But in his view, doing nothing was the greater risk. If he failed, he would be remembered as reckless. But if he succeeded, he would prove that true sovereignty is not given. It is claimed, defended, and lived. And in a continent tired of waiting for validation, that message was louder than any bullet, stronger than any sanction. By mid-2025, the situation in Burkina Faso had become a case study in global realignment. Traore's alliance with Russia was no longer an isolated event. It had become a regional shift in loyalty, logic, and legacy. The West, once seen as the inevitable overseer of African futures, now found its influence crumbling across the Sahel. The old colonial compact had been broken, but in its place stood uncertainty, resistance, and a rising tide of African assertiveness. In the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, young people no longer asked how to flee their countries. They asked how to defend them. Billboards no longer showcased Western-funded projects. They featured slogans about sovereignty, resistance, and reclamation. But inspiration alone could not stop bullets. The insurgency raged on. Armed groups emboldened by chaos continued launching attacks in remote provinces. In some regions, they gained ground. Humanitarian agencies reported rising numbers of displaced people. Traore faced the painful contradiction of his revolution. While geopolitics shifted in his favor, the battlefield had told a messier truth. Russian forces provided support, yes, but they were not miracle workers. They offered tactics, equipment, and training, but they could not erase the scars of decades of instability in a few months. The enemy was not just on the outside. It lived within the nation's own institutions, remnants of a broken past, of loyalties purchased by foreign interests, of officers who would rather sell their future than fight for it. And yet, amid that darkness, something remarkable was happening. In villages once cut off from the state, new command posts began to appear. In regions once surrendered to extremists, Burkina Faso patrols returned, not as foreign-led missions, but as joint units trained by their own. The people, watching closely, began to believe that the tide could, perhaps, shift. This belief became the government's greatest weapon. Schools reopened in reclaimed areas. Agricultural collectives received funding to replant abandoned fields. Civil defense networks sprang up, not just as militias, but as organized citizen groups, ready to report, resist, and rebuild. It was a war not just for land, but for the soul of the nation. And through every hardship, Traore doubled down on one message. Burkina Faso would not be saved from the outside. The Russians were allies, not saviors. The work belonged to the people. This clear separation of roles was what made his partnership with Moscow so different from the Western interventions of the past. There was no illusion that foreign boots would bring lasting peace. That was Burkina Faso's responsibility, and his speeches never allowed anyone to forget it. Still, criticism mounted. Some in the diaspora accused him of trading sovereignty for survival. Western analysts questioned whether this new alliance was sustainable or simply reactive. But what they failed to understand was that in Traoré's mind, sustainability did not begin with money. It began with memory. He understood that his people did not need perfection. They needed to see someone willing to risk everything for dignity. And that's what he gave them. Not promises, but presence. Not fantasy, but fight. In every televised address, he reminded the nation of what had been lost. Not just lives, but years, decades of silence, dependence, humiliation. He spoke not as a ruler above the people, but as one of them. And that, more than Russian tanks or foreign grain shipments, became the cornerstone of his survival. He built legitimacy not by pleasing powers abroad, but by speaking truths at home. And slowly, painfully, the people began to echo those truths. As the sun sets over the red soil of the Sahel, the outlines of a new future are beginning to emerge. Not yet solid, not yet certain, but undeniably different. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stands not as a symbol of perfection, but as a challenge to everything that came before. He is not universally loved. He is not without flaws. But what he represents is something that generations have quietly prayed for. A leader willing to defy the script, to reject the inherited chains, and to choose risk over submission. His alliance with Russia has reshaped the geopolitical terrain, fractured old loyalties, and revealed deep truths about where power really resides. It has not solved every crisis. It has not ended terrorism. But it has given the people of Burkina Faso something they have not felt in decades: ownership of their pain, of their problems, and perhaps for the first time, of their path forward. The West continues to warn, reports are published, panels convene, sanctions are whispered and drafted. But something irreversible has already happened. A corner of Africa, long considered expendable, has reminded the world and itself that dignity is non-negotiable, that sovereignty is not a reward to be granted, but a right to be reclaimed. Traoré's speeches are not laced with diplomacy, they are filled with fire. He does not thank the past for its lessons. He accuses it of its crimes. And this tone, sharp as it may be, is not bitterness, it is clarity. A clarity forged through coups survived, plots dismantled, and bullets dodged. The Russian troops stationed in Ouagadougou are not invisible. Their presence sparks debate even among Traoré's supporters. But most do not see them as colonizers. They see them as a mirror, reflecting back the fact that, finally, Burkina Faso gets to choose who stands beside it. That choice in itself is the victory. In 2025, the Alliance of Sahel States is no longer a theoretical bloc. It is a political entity. With a shared bank, a proposed currency, and a collective defense pact, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are building more than alliances. They are building history. And history, once written in Paris and Washington, is now being drafted in Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou. This movement is young, fragile, and heavily contested. It faces real enemies, foreign and domestic. It faces hunger, war, and isolation. But it also carries something more dangerous to its opponents than any weapon: belief. Belief that Africa can stand alone, that sovereignty can be more than a speech, that leaders can look their people in the eye and not blink. Traoré has made his choice. He has placed his trust not in treaties, but in the courage of his people. He has wagered everything on a future that does not yet exist. And whether it succeeds or falls, the world will remember that for one moment, in the heat and hardship of West Africa, a leader stood up, not to please, not to survive, but to say what so many before him were too afraid to say: we are not yours to control. We are not waiting for rescue. We are not afraid to choose. And now that choice has been made.